Hi, everybody. Good morning. It's a tough act to follow. Very excited to be here. This is my first PopTech ever. I'm also very excited to be in Maine. This is my second time in Maine in just the last few months. I was here over the summer and was on vacation. I had a ton of lobster rolls, which was great, and I had some last night too. So it's a great state. I've done some reporting here about the clean elections and political system, and I love being here. So I have the honor this morning of presenting what I think will be the lightest, and we can all agree upon the most fun topic we'll talk about all weekend, and that is gun violence and nuclear weapons. So it's Saturday morning. I hope everybody's had their coffee. And I tried to come up with a very simple title for this presentation just to distill down how really light and fun this topic is going to be, and here's what I came up with. So how do we get people to care about horrible and dense and tragic topics that seemingly have no solution? They're very depressing, and what are we going to do about it? I promise you the talk is not going to be all depressing. We're going to talk about some solutions, and it will be optimistic, but this is a tough problem to crack, right? So before we get going, and just to depress everybody a little bit, let me take a quick poll of the audience. I heard this last night from our speakers, which I'm going to introduce. Just shout it out. How many nuclear weapons do people think exist in the world today? Who's got an idea? Throw out a number. 40,000. Oh, wow, 40,000. I was expecting lower. Anybody else? 10,000. So the answer is 16,000. 16,000 nuclear weapons, which I was surprised about. You know, we tend to think the Cold War is over. There's 16,000 nuclear weapons across 9 different countries legally, anyway. And let me ask another stat. So how many gun deaths do people think, deaths as a result of gun violence do people think happen every day in the US? 30,000 a day. A day. Stealing the thunder. So the answer is 88. 88 gun deaths a day, which is the equivalent of a major plane crash every 3 days. I mean, it's a really shocking number when you think about it. So there's 2 tweets which I want to show, which I think really set up the problem that we want to talk about here. So the first comes from Dan Hodges, who is a commentator at The Telegraph. And this came in June, right after the tragic shooting in Charleston, South Carolina. So just take a minute to read that. And the second tweet comes from California Representative Mike Thompson, and this was more recent. This was after the latest Oregon shooting. And just take a moment to read that. So why did I show these tweets? Well, I think what they represent is they really talk about the scope of the problem when you talk about something like gun violence. I work in the media, and these are problems that are big flashpoints when we have mass shootings in the US, and I could probably speak for all of us and say that every time one of these things happens, they feel so partisan, so polarized. A shooting happens, it's either a gun problem or it's a mental health problem, it's a Republican issue, it's a Democratic issue. The President, Obama himself, has stood before the nation 11 times for mass shootings, asking and pleading for action. I've seen friends in Australia and the UK befuddled as to why we can't do anything more in this country about gun violence. And working in the media, it's one of those things where the day of a mass shooting, there's a lot of attention, and then 2 days and 3 days later, it feels like the public's attention has waned. So clearly very dense, hard, polarizing problem to solve. Now, before we get to the optimistic part, we have to talk a little bit about nuclear weapons, which is another example of an incredibly dense, polarizing, very muddled, hard to understand issue, right? I was surprised about the number of nuclear weapons that still exist. We hear our presidential candidates on the debate stage say that sometimes that nuclear weapons are a national security and foreign policy priority, but they don't really get a whole lot of attention these days, and it can be one of these things that feels like it's sort of beyond the mind. So, we face this challenge directly at Mike. So here's a photo of my interview with President Obama earlier this summer. And I interviewed the president about the nuclear deal, the Iran nuclear deal. Spent a lot, this was our first interview at Mike with the president. Spent a lot of time sourcing questions from young people all over the world. And I remember distinctly the moment before the interview in which I was sitting down. We were in DC with my entire team, video team, editors, mind you, this is the most savvy, well-plugged-in people in all of media. And I asked them, what do you want me to ask the president about Iran? And I heard from my team either, I don't know enough to care, I'm not really sure, you go figure it out, and some combination of the above. So even the most plugged-in people in media had a very hard time understanding nuclear weapons, thinking about nuclear weapons, and really knowing what to ask about them. And so I think what these two issues share in common, the title of this talk is Humans and Humanity. These are obviously both issues that tremendously, tremendously affect us, and the future really relies on us solving them, and yet they're very dense, hard to solve issues. So now, enough of the depressing piece. I want to talk about some solutions and put two things out to the audience which I think are really, really important on this issue. So the first thing is, I think we have to get over the stigma that these are issues that are too dense to talk about and that they can't be discussed. And the way that we're going to do that is by leveraging media and being very, very creative about storytelling. Let's go back to this Iran nuclear deal for a minute. Again, people said, there's no way you're going to get young people to care about Iran. This is too dense of a topic. And in fact, we found quite the opposite. And so what we did was we took questions from young people in Iran, in Israel, in the US, and we posed them to President Obama on an iPad. So we actually answered directly questions from young people. And we also presented a series of graphics to explain what was going on. And we used a very conversational tone. So the questions that I asked the president were very much those same questions that young people asked me the night before our interview. I asked them, young people don't necessarily know if this is a priority. What do you have to say about that? And so what's the lesson? Well, I think the lesson is storytelling is really, really important if we're going to break through on these dense topics. And being very creative about understanding who your audience is and trying to really represent them. And so the question that I always ask editors at Mike is this a story you'd be sharing with your friends over dinner at a bar? And if it is, that's really a story that we want to be telling and the voice we want to be representing. And we live in such an era now of social media, Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram, you name it, that we can get really creative about the way that we leverage media and tell these stories. So that's piece one. Piece two, now you're telling good stories, but how do we get government to act on this issue? These feel like, Congress has never felt more gridlocked. These feel like very, very hard issues to solve. And what I'll say to you is it was not too long ago when people said marijuana legalization and same-sex marriage were these two big, dense issues that couldn't be solved either. And what happened was there was a groundswell of grassroots organizing at the local and state levels to really attack these issues. And on gun violence, the polling is there. If you ask people, 85% of people say they would like to have more gun legislation in the US. And 80% of people say that they'd like to see more regulation to support mental health and fix the mental health system. So the polling is there. And then you look at nuclear weapons. There was a poll done of over 20 countries which showed that 76% of people want to get rid of all nuclear weapons. The polling is there. What's exciting is the organizations that you're about to hear from are actually doing this work on the ground. They're doing the local and grassroots organizing needed. And so I wanted to show this stat. There's an organization called Everytown, which one of the speakers has been a part of, Jason. And they've done real work on the state and local level, and they've seen real action. So, just in Sandy Hook, it can feel like nothing's happened, but 6 states have passed background checks, 12 have closed loopholes, and 15 have defeated bills that would allow people to carry guns in schools. And so change is really happening. And I spoke not too long ago, to a woman named Erica Lafferty, who's the daughter of Principal Dawn Hochsprung, who was killed in the Sandy Hook shooting. Some folks may have remembered her name. And she told me that, I asked her, how are you feeling on this issue? And she said she's actually never felt more hopeful and optimistic. And the reason is, she couldn't remember a time when, on the national debate stage in a presidential election, candidates were debating over how bad their rating is amongst the NRA, whether it's a D or an F. And it's getting national attention now in a way that it wasn't just 2 or 3 election cycles ago. And so what I'd say to you, going back to my very complicated question, is it is very possible to create change on these issues. And what I think we're going to need is grassroots organizing at a local and a state level, coupled with really creative storytelling and really creative leveraging of social media and other media platforms to break through on these topics. And we're seeing it starting to happen with gun control. We're seeing it with nuclear weapons. With that, my time is up, but I want to introduce you to a series of really, really fantastic speakers who I know you're going to be excited about, and it won't be that depressing on a Saturday. Thank you so much.
Thank you for being here.